Thanks everyone for joining us on our second webinar. Today we are going to hear from less panelists than last time and on different topics. So hopefully you get lots out of this webinar and actually learn some new things. I'm going to share my desktop really quick and make a plug for the Wildfire messaging guide that came out about 2 weeks ago. The panelists today will be discussing the contents of this guide. It is not a super long document, but it's also not a super short document. So I just wanted to really quickly show people how it's laid out. The table of contents breaks this down for you, but I'm just going to go through it. The first page shows all the organizations that supported the guide and gives you just a little blurb about the guide. And then there's an introduction. And if you're interested in a snapshot of these messages, you can go ahead and skip this intro and just go right to the messages. But this intro gives some good background info. So if you do have time to read through these 2 pages, I would encourage it. This is the meat of the guide right here, where we unpack some of the core science. And we'll be getting deeper into this today on our call. We developed these new infographics for folks to use. These are unbranded infographics that you can use in your communications, either email, social media, or if you're giving like a PowerPoint presentation. So feel free to use these graphics, these messages, of course, use them however you'd like. There are 11 messages that address some of the basic science. And then we conclude the guide with 5 solutions, starting at the most important with community and home safety and resilience, moving to other more nuanced points about climate change and fire management. Carbon storage is number 4, and again, another carbon solution at the end. So those are the 5 solutions. We have a robust glossary, so if any of these terms are confusing to you, you can look those up. And we spent a lot of time making sure that everything in the guide was backed up by at least 1 scientific article. So if you're interested in nerding out a little bit, we have hyperlinked to all of these scientific studies. You just click on these links and it will bring you right to the science. And from there, you can dive even deeper. And I would encourage you to check out a few of these if you're interested. At the end, we have some hashtags that you can use and a Facebook page where there's a lot of this content is being posted on a regular basis. Thriving with Fire. It's a really great Facebook page, so check it out if you haven't. All right, so with that, I will now introduce our panelists, and I'll turn it over to them. First, we'll be hearing from Sam Krop, who is the grassroots organizer at Cascadia Wildlands. Sam is a grassroots educator and community organizer who works on a wide variety of topics, but she's mostly focused on public lands, monitoring, and citizen engagement. So she gets folks out into the woods, teaches them about fire ecology and about the policy process to engage with, to make sure that certain lands are protected from commercial logging. Sam is going to be giving us a snapshot of how the fire phobia, the misinformation about wildfire, is used to justify logging projects that otherwise would not be okay with the public. So she'll give us a 5-minute kind of frame the issue introduction. Next, we'll hear from Timothy Ingalsbee. Tim is the co-founder and executive director of Firefighters United for Safety, Ethics, and Ecology, FUSEE. Tim is also an educator at University of Oregon, where he's the faculty research associate. Tim used to be a firefighter for the Forest Service, and I'm pretty sure he also spent time fighting fires for the National Park Service. So Tim is going to be telling us more about fire suppression and how we can reform some of our management practices to be more ecologically smart and to prioritize homes and communities over other values. Lastly, we'll hear from Courtney Rae, who is the Associate Director of BARC. Courtney is a lifelong activist and organizer, and these days she is an educator in Portland and in the communities near Mount Hood, where she seeks to empower local communities to advocate for the protection of Mount Hood. And she is going to tell us more about some of the work she's doing on that front and how it relates to forest carbon and climate adaptation. So with that, I will turn it over to Sam, who's going to give us the intro. Sam, take it away.
So thanks, Alex. My name is Sam. Again, I spend a lot of time doing work monitoring and doing on-the-ground surveying and exploring of timber sales throughout the western range of Oregon. And I was tasked with talking a little bit about how this work around fire messaging really impacts the work that we're doing here on the ground in public lands defense. And I think that one thing that I can say for certain is that misunderstandings and misinformation about wildfire have directly resulted in mismanagement of forests. And time and again, we're seeing examples of this happening on the ground. So I'm going to quickly talk about just a few examples, one being the picture that you're looking at right now. And these are examples of how essentially a fear of fire combined with a reaction to the presence of fire on the landscape, a reaction to the possibility of fire on the landscape, and even sometimes a reaction to the absence of fire on the landscape have all resulted in different kinds of irresponsible forest management and in often the case, rampant clear cutting. So this example here is the Horse Prairie Fire Recovery Plan. That's what it was called. It was proposed directly after the 2017 Horse Prairie Fire. And this was one stand that I went out to see as part of the fire. This obviously looks like a more high severity burn, but the entire fire was a mixed severity fire. There were some areas that really didn't burn at all and others that were stand replacing. And the immediate response from the Roseburg BLM was that essentially they wanted to conduct a timely harvest of all of the marketable trees remaining in the area. And so this was a salvage logging proposal, a so-called salvage logging proposal, and essentially a clear-cut proposal. And so this photo, I think, provides some context for why another reason why this was so problematic. While this clear cut was not part of the Horse Prairie sale, it was private land directly adjacent to it. So in the distance, you can see the one remaining patch of forest. That was the Horse Prairie sale, which this picture was taken in. So unfortunately, we were not able to stop the BLM from pursuing this project, and they went ahead and clear cut that remaining burned forest, creating essentially this moonscape that you see here. So that's an example. This example here is that the first one is an example, I think, of response to the presence of fire on a landscape being clear cutting. And so this one is a bit different. This is an example of a response to fear of fire or the possibility of fire on a landscape being clear cutting. And so this is a current timber sale, the Poor Windy timber sale in Grants Pass, BLM. And this photograph is a picture that they have on the front cover of the environmental assessment. I think that it's their way of describing what they're seeing in the sale. And so they're really making the argument that most of the forest in this sale, it looks like this. It looks kind of like there's a lot of ladder fuels and maybe potentially would benefit from doing some fire management. But when we went out there, actually, what we found was this. So on the left, you can see really beautiful, multi-aged, layered canopy. On the right, some evidence of a fire already having been through the area and done the work for them of clearing out what they call hazardous fuels. And really, boots on the ground for this sale have shown that this is a full of old growth forest that there's really no sense in logging at all. But the reason is the possibility of fire in the future perhaps will clear cut. And so my last example is, I think, just demonstrates a complete misunderstanding of how fire operates on a landscape and the role of fire in a healthy forest. And this is the Thurston Hills timber sale, which is located in Springfield, BLM, and it's the closest public lands timber sale to town, here in Eugene. And essentially what it does is it proposes to put a giant clear cut in the backyards of Springfield residents and demonstrates a huge misunderstanding of the role and the impacts that that would have for the community, by essentially acknowledging the fact that, well, clear cuts do make fire hazard more concerning, but we're going to go ahead and do it anyways in the backyards of Springfield residents. So I think these three examples are just three of the dozens that we are seeing all the time, that are just using different interpretations of fire that are either misinformed or intentionally spreading misinformation to essentially advocate for more aggressive logging on public lands, whether it be for fire prevention or after the effects of a fire being on the landscape, or just simply not considering the role of fire at all in what a healthy forest ecosystem is. So this work feels really important this conversation feels really important to the work that we're doing here on the ground and the timber sale monitoring. And I think that now is the time really for us to be seriously considering how to message this better, because the effects on the ground are real, and now more than ever we need to be protecting public lands and not allowing misinformation to support aggressive logging. So I'm happy to take questions about any of these sales, and I can also pass it off to Tim.
Before we go to Tim, I would love to hear if there are any questions on the line. And if you have a question, just feel free to speak up and go for it.
Hi, this is Francis. It's interesting to note that the Highway 97 fire, the big blaze, biggest blaze burning in Oregon now, is burning within the poor windy timber sale units. So it'll be interesting to see how they have fared from this additional fire activity started by an illegal campfire.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Thank you for bringing that up, Francis. And that's another thing that we have been seeing too, is just the failure for management bodies to acknowledge when a fire does have an effect on a timber sale area. We saw a similar thing happen with another timber sale up by Brighton Bush, where a fire came through and there was no additional analysis for the changes that the fire made on the landscape. And so again, like just another example of how failure to understand and monitor and actually watch what a fire is actually doing is just resulting in like continued poor logging practices.
So if there is not another question or comment, I don't hear anybody. So Tim, go for it. Please share your screen, and thanks, Sam.
Hello, folks. Can everyone hear me?
Yep, we can hear you.
Great. All right. Well, I really appreciate Alex for organizing this and all you folks for logging on. A quick word about FUSEE, Firefighters United for Safety, Ethics, and Ecology. We're a nonprofit who do public education, policy advocacy for safe, ethical, ecological fire management. And one of our goals is not only let's correctly identify what are the problems we're facing, but we need a vision for a solution. And so that's kind of what I'm going to be addressing here. Here's the basic outline of what I'm going to go through today. Really turning out what is our vision of what we call ecological fire management. a reminder of our unique relationship with fire, talk about this thing we call the fire deficit, just addressing, touching on fuels management, and then concluding with, how do we grapple with the climate crisis and the crisis of forest management and wildfire. So first of all, a broad vision of ecological fire management. Where we want to be someday is fire adapted communities living safely and sustainably in fire permeable landscapes where fire can safely pass through the landscape without causing destruction, death to people and their properties. And a basic philosophy for ecological fire management is every fire management action must include ecological objectives. That even includes suppression. There will be times and places where we will have to aggressively stop the spread of fire to avoid an ecological disaster of an incinerated community or other high values. And the real orientation will be using fire, working with fire rather than fighting against it. Now we have to justify, not aggressively fighting fire. In the future, that will be reversed. You'll have to make an argument. Why are you putting people at risk trying to stop nature's fire here? So broadly, the goals were to maximize the social and ecological benefits of burning. Social and ecological are really thinking holistically part of one system, socio-ecological benefits, and mitigate the risk and hazards to firefighters and the public. Fighting fire is inherently risky, hazardous to the health of firefighters. It better be worth it. There are other alternatives that lower those risks and hazards. Minimize the cost to taxpayers. This annual, perpetual, endless, escalating war on wildfires costing us billions, and there are alternatives that what better make use of those dollars and resources. And above all, avoid the damage to the land that comes from conventional suppression actions. They do cause collateral damage, this war on wildfire. So one of the methods is actively and intentionally manage fire through prescribed fire, wildland fire use. Someday in the future, all fires from whatever ignition source, whatever location, will be managed with pre-planned ecological social objectives. It would be like managing wildfires like prescribed fires, and this will be very intentional. Well thought out of, well cared for. We're going to be starting more prescribed fires rather than trying to stop all wildfires. And it really depends on pre-fire planning and preparation. The notions of fire prevention and fire suppression, we're going to really have to change those. Instead of prevention, which is really impossible until we stop the lightning and pave over the planet, preparation is what is really entailed. And right now, for good and bad, the government has largely a monopolization of fire management, but the government doesn't have enough people or resources. In some cases, lacks will to implement ecological fire management. We're going to have to combine the agencies and communities. Agencies have the technical knowledge and know-how. Communities have the labor force and knowledge of local values and such. And we're going to have to really pitch in together, all of us, to implement ecological fire management, because we're all going to have to live with fire. Of course, safety first is for firefighters, citizens, communities, and ecosystems. And this is something that FUSEE really pitches. Land safety. We should not imperil other species or the ecosystems itself to make the land safe for firefighting. That's just got it back-asswards. So let's remind ourselves of our species' unique relationship with fire. And again, this looking holistically as one system. Typically, people look at the upper left and say, well, that's a social disaster. In our view, it's an ecological disaster. This suburb of Santa Rosa, incinerated, is now a hazardous toxic waste site, and it devastated the land, air, and water before and during and after the burning. That picture on the lower right, that's a social disaster. That natural heritage legacy of that burned forest gone for generations to come. So we really want to think in terms holistically of social ecological systems and how to manage for that. Human beings, well, first of all, fire's been on this earth for over 400 million years, and we assume we'll be here 400 million years in the future. And hominids began using fire over 1 million years ago. It was a vital reciprocity that gave life to both. People fed and sheltered fire, and in return, fire helped feed and shelter us. And we would not have our species physically evolved, culturally evolved with our unique relationship with fire. Particularly the example from indigenous peoples worldwide have used fire to steward the land. And many native flora and fauna have co-evolved with native burning as an important source of fire. And that heritage is right here at hand. We still have indigenous peoples on this continent with memories of that legacy and that knowledge. Euro-American colonization settlement, it had complex effects. It wasn't just like when white people came, they eliminated all fire. In some cases, they brought a lot more fire, very severe fire, railroads kicking up sparks through logged over stump lands, horrendous fires, miners torching mountainsides to expose the ores, very, very hot fires. But then the Forest Service kind of imposed its policy of systematic fire suppression with the goal of excluding and extirpating fires from the landscape. So here we have a great anomaly, 1 million years of human fire use versus approximately 150 years of fire suppression. We just suffer from a kind of cultural amnesia of our species' unique relationship, vital reciprocity with fire and the land. So it has had enormous, not just ecological impacts, but cultural impacts too. This is, some people would argue this is part of what makes us human. It might be human beings' ecological role on Earth to steward the land with fire. And so the period of fire exclusion even precedes that of effective fire suppression. So it's not just the fires we have put out in the last several decades, but the fires we've failed to put in through the elimination of indigenous burning and other sources. Don't keep it lit, extinguish it. Yeah, that's the message of smoking. So there is this widespread perception, of course, that there's too much fire. It's an abundance of fire. And the media is constantly saying, this record-setting, unprecedented fire season of, too much fire. Well, prior to the 1950s, 20 to 40 million acres on average burned every year. And there was no fire crisis, there was no hysteria. But after World War II, and especially after the Korean War, it plummeted to barely 3 million acres. It's inching up to about 10 million acres. The Forest Service predicts it could go up to 12 million acres in the near future. That's still far, far less than the 20 to 40 million acres. And this is a graphic from the Fire Message Guide. Kind of explains what happened. That middle section during the cool, wet climate period, well, that coincided with the introduction of mechanized fire suppression and the application of fire physics and science to putting out fires. It kind of gave us the illusion that we could actually control and conquer wildfire. We had a lot of help from the weather. Now the weather, of course, is changing. The climate is changing, and wildfire activity is picking up because of climate change. There's still nowhere near the amount of fire and the activity of fire prior to that cool, wet period. But we have come up to the limits of effective fire suppression. And so scientists have calculated about 23 million acres total need to burn each year, 12 million acres annually just in the Western 11 states, but they don't because we're putting out these fires. This photo actually is from a prescribed fire. You can see the amount of char at the base of that tree. That was the layer, that was the amount of duff and litter that the prescribed fire helped recycle into soil, and it's gone now. Fire deficit, Not too much fire, no, not enough. A lot more fire used to burn in the past, and a lot more needs to burn in the present and future in perpetuity. So climate change is increasing fire activity, but we're still suppressing fire. You're attacking most fires. We're putting out the low intensity fires in the spring and late fall, and then we're just kind of helpless in stopping fires during the peak intensity of middle of summer. Big controversial area. What to thin? Well, first, there's many different methods of fuels management. We listed them out here. The Forest Service and other agencies have a bias towards mechanical means because these are big machines run by few hands. They're the most expensive kind of fuels treatment, but they're the most profitable to the industry that has these contracts. The thing is, they're just not feasible through most of the landscape that's too steep, too remote, or in wilderness or wilderness areas that you just can't do them. So even though they have a bias towards that, they're very limited. Manual fuels treatments, hand tools, even chainsaws perhaps, held by many hands. These are lots of jobs, and our vision is, if perhaps part of a Green New Deal, a Green New Fire workforce doing lots of manual fuels treatments where needed, lots of jobs. Chemical applications are herbicides. That's very toxic to the wildlife, to the water, but it also in some ways makes it worse by killing the shrubs. When fires do come, they're highly flammable. You got these dead aerial fuels and they produce toxic smoke. Biological methods, the livestock grazers pitch, the livestock grazing will prevent wildfires, not unless they're grazed down to bare mineral soil and kept that way. Some people use goats near their house. That's not bad, but very limited application. So the best option is use fire. There's nothing like fire that influences fire. And so it's the most effective, least expensive, the most natural, but it is perceived to be very risky to land managers, and it does produce smoke. By the way, when you use fire, you're not just reducing fuels, you're in many ways restoring ecosystems. It's a twofer. Or the other method, you're just reducing fuels. You're not really providing all those other ecological benefits that come only with fire. So ecological fuels management is really restoring fire as a process. Use manual, what we call pre-treatments as necessary, but fire must be an essential part of any and every fuels treatment. Thinning alone will not do it. And too many, almost most of these fuels management projects are still oriented to a fire exclusion goal. This will help us fight fires, this will help us prevent fires, and we've got to switch that. Any and every fuels management project or treatment must be tied to restoring fire as a process. So the question of backcountry thinning versus community fire preparation, what will protect homes best? We can selectively, strategically thin the thin stuff, okay? The shrubs, saplings, poles, but not the thick stuff. When they start hauling out commercial grade saw logs or the overstory, that in many ways makes it more flammable. It removes the shade, the sun and the wind, the protection of that. But you thin where is needed to start reintroducing fire. And there really is a necessary sequential order in that. First start with the homes, protect them, get them fire safe, fireproof. Then we have more options how we manage fire in the backcountry. And here's a example. One of our members is done the thinning around the home to the point that now he can apply fire right on his doorstep. So conclusion, let's be reminded, the real burning issue of our time is global warming, not wildfire. And it's a bit of a distraction. Anything and everything we do to the forest to stop wildfire won't mean anything while we're still pumping up fossil fuel carbon emissions. And, and really, as my colleagues are presenting, forests are vital for stabilizing the climate, and fires are vital for sustaining forests. They're part and parcel of the same thing. So here's just at the end kind of laundry list of potential values, benefits of ecological fire management, and protecting forests, preparing communities, preventing homes from burning, promoting burning, preserving biodiversity, particularly of fire-dependent species who are suffering from fire exclusion. And this is another topic another time, but really using fire will really sequester and store the most forest carbon over time, which will help stabilize the climate. And then bottom line, saving lives, money, and the environment. Hashtag ecological fire management. Thanks, folks.
Mic drop. That was awesome, Tim. Who has a question for Tim? If you have a question, just go ahead and speak up.
Well, my apologies for going over time. I really looking forward to Courtney's talk, so we can rush through Q&A. Let's see what Courtney has to say.
Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit more specifically about some of the messages in the guide. And so here's one of the pages. And I'm going to talk specifically about messages 4, 5, and 6, but I'm going to do them in the order of 6, 4, 5. And this is a page straight out of the guide, so you don't need to take any notes or anything. And I think one big takeaway, and Tim did a great job of leading us into this, is that fire is kind of overshadowing the bigger picture here. We're kind of missing the forest for the fire, to kind of adapt that old cliche. And so when we, especially in terms of climate change, a lot of the conversation has zeroed in on fire, and that has kind of left a lot of bigger and more important aspects of the role that forests play in our global climate systems at the wayside. And fire is obviously very dramatic, and so it's something that's going to get a lot of attention, and it is our task to reframe this, kind of like back that focus out to a bigger picture, so that people understand, especially people who are focused on finding material ways to address climate change, have real useful information rather than kind of sensationalized information to back them up. So we hope that you find this guide useful. So first of all, message number 6, climate change drives wildfires, but wildfires do not drive climate change. Climate change is affecting wildfire, and it is affecting all of the Earth's natural processes. But as you've learned, wildfires are influenced mostly by weather. And since climate change is already impacting local weather conditions around the world, we are likely to see conditions in our region that are more suitable for fire across more of our region in the future. So this is some data about the area between the Columbia Gorge and Mount Hood. You can see Mount Hood there, kind of the top center, is a little white spot amongst the blue. That's the peak of Mount Hood. And then that area that's outlined goes all the way down and includes the entirety of the Willamette National Forest as well. And over the next 180 so years, you can see that the areas that are suitable or more likely have better conditions, physical conditions to have fire, start to really expand. And so this climate modeling is showing higher temperatures and reduced precipitation in some times of the year, increasing summer drought, and that will likely increase the opportunity for fire to occur on the landscape. And so while we do anticipate fire regimes changing, at this point, oops, I need to switch my slide here. Right now, emissions from wildfire are not really a source of extra carbon in the atmosphere. Scientists estimate that wildfires make up about 5 to 10% of an annual carbon emissions. And those are emissions that have always existed in the Earth's climate cycles and carbon cycles. And so those emissions should be considered something that could be naturally balanced were humans not impacting the functionality of those systems. The best estimates of global CO2 emissions from wildfires alone are dwarfed, as Tim mentioned, completely by the burning of fossil fuels. And so when we talk about reducing emissions, we should really be focusing on fossil fuels. fire is a pittance comparatively, and also the Earth systems have already accounted for fire emissions and can deal with them if they're functioning well. In the Pacific Northwest, and in Oregon in particular, fire is really dominating the conversation. But this chart, which is also in the guide, really shows that despite the dramatic appearance of smoke and fire, in terms of Oregon, focusing on fire just kind of distracts from the real culprits, and maybe that's why fire receives so much focus. We should consider that there are lots of people who pull the strings of public discourse and media, and fire makes for a very dramatic red herring in this situation. At the same time, I find this chart to be slightly misleading because they're including fire here alongside human-caused emissions, while fire is not a human-caused emissions. And so I think some information that would be useful to dig up would be a look at all of the natural emissions, fire, volcanoes, natural decomposition of organic material, and all of the kinds of things that will typically happen in the carbon cycle on the planet, and then compare that to all of the human sources to see exactly how what the impact of what the increase is over what the Earth can handle compared to what it has been handling for millions of years. So that would be an interesting illustration if anyone has that. I looked and looked and couldn't find something that did quite that. Okay, so on to message number 4. Western forests can help us fight climate change by capturing and storing vast amounts of carbon if protected from industrial activities. So again, we're going to scale out to the full Earth for a second here. The upper left image is current biomass stocks globally, and then the lower image is what are potential. And so we're less than half, basically, of what the world's forests could support. Were they allowed to return? And it's not just forests, actually, it's all vegetation. So there's grasslands and other things in there too. And if they were allowed to function naturally, their capacity for bringing carbon out of the atmosphere would double. And honestly, without these plants, we would be cooking under billions and billions of additional tons of carbon compared to what we even have to deal with right now. And plants are the only thing that can pull carbon out of the atmosphere in this quantity. But we have, as you all know, really decimated many of the forests and other ecosystems that have a big role to play in the carbon cycle. The oceans in particular and the forests are the two big players. And so protecting our carbon sinks and enhancing their natural functionality, it represents at least 30% of what we need to do in order to avert total climate collapse. So 1/3 of our time should be spent restoring these natural systems, and maybe the rest of it spent reducing our human-caused emissions. Here, and for many folks on this call, in the United States, public lands are one of our biggest opportunities to start implementing some of those kinds of solutions. National forests in particular occupy millions and millions of acres. I see almost 200 million acres of national forests in the country, but they are currently managed with timber quotas, and priority funding from Congress goes to the national forest managers to direct them to facilitate timber sales and logging. There is no such thing as a carbon reserve in the national forest system, for example, and there are no mandates from Congress right now that the Forest Service do its activities in an effort to increase carbon storage. That stuff doesn't exist. Those are the kinds of things that would be a big step in the US system, in the United States system, in terms of increasing our forest carbon. Oregon and Washington, and really the Pacific Northwest as a whole, has a big role to play in this. If we look at this map here, you can see us there in the Pacific Northwest on the lower slide, the lower image. We are one of the places in the northern hemisphere that has really robust and deep storing carbon capacity. let's see. So for bark, we have been focusing on the lowest level of national forest policy, which is our local forest plan for the Mount Hood National Forest, and working to find ways to kind of interject into those management priorities, protections for the areas that have the most carbon, and then standards and guidelines that would direct the agency to help to increase carbon on areas that don't currently have very much protection or have lost much of their carbon capacity from past management. Yeah, this is a graphic that's included in the guide. And on our 200 million acres of national forest, we are continuing to have a priority of industrial logging, and you can see that that puts us at what we are calling a carbon debt. And so it's the lost carbon that those trees once held, and it's also the lost future carbon that those trees would be able to sequester had they been left to grow. And again, we don't have the policy mechanisms to make the agencies manage for carbon, at least not right now. And we don't necessarily have tools to make them account for the losses that they incur through their actions. So we hope that you'll bring that into conversation around climate solutions, is to change forest management in these ways. This is also in the guide for your use. There are benefits from all forests, but in particular, long-lived forests where the stand ages are getting older. You see into the 300-400 years, the amount of carbon that those forests hold continues to rise. One thing that is commonly thrown around is that younger forests, because they're growing faster, have a higher carbon capacity. And what that turns into is a license to clear cut, because if you take every tree away, then you have the most space for those fast young trees, those fast growing young trees. But the data actually shows the opposite, and we need to protect the older forests and to allow younger forests to actually reach maturity and old age in order to maximize the carbon stores in those areas. So here's some solutions we've got outlined for our public lands, which is really important in the Pacific Northwest as we have so much of this space. Protect all mature and old growth forests. Rivers and streams and wetlands as well really provide, just as well as climate refuge for wildlife, some of the places that have the deepest carbon stores, and to protect them from any industry or exploitation or extraction, including logging, obviously. Ending commercial logging on public lands, defend and strengthening bedrock environmental laws like the National Environmental Policy Act, which is under threat, and Endangered Species Acts and things like that are constantly being challenged by not only by unhelpful administrations, but even by agencies who find them to be, kind of like a pain to them in terms of their goals that they have to set for themselves. And then also to require that agencies analyze the carbon and climate impacts of their actions, both the negative impacts that the actions that they're going to take would cause, and the potential that their actions could have for positive impacts in their planning. And then on private lands, we have a real big opportunity to recover that carbon debt if we have better forestry practices that take climate and carbon into consideration. So for one thing, we could, and this is, for effect, you can see just how frequently and how regularly we rotate our forests out without allowing them to reach that deep sequestration stage in the hundreds of years. We can, first of all, reduce our use of freshly harvested wood and require increased recycled industry materials like lumber and pellets, and recycling of wood structures instead of demolishing them. And then when it's necessary to use freshly harvested wood, we should, on private lands and state lands in particular, increase the time between harvests. It's currently around 40 years is kind of a typical harvest cycle. Doubling that to 80, or if we could make it longer, would be better. And increasing the size of buffer zones around streams and rivers, preventing commercial logging in those areas. And as you can see, even along the major rivers, there's often logging projects that are directly adjacent, and if not that, then they're up in the headwaters. And those, that has a carbon impact. It also impacts the quality and temperature of those streams, and then therefore the quality and temperature of the bigger water bodies as the water flows down. And then to regulate logging practices so that they protect and restore forest ecosystems rather than treating forests and trees like crops. And so again, I think that it's great to have pay attention to fire and to recognize that, especially in our part of the country, it's going to have a really big, it can have a big impact on people's personal lives and property. And we know exactly how to protect people from that. But if we continue to look at a forest and be concerned about fire with the most of our attention, rather than looking at this bigger picture of the global systems that really regulate carbon, and especially in our part of the world, we have some of these right here under our stewardship. And so on the public lands and on the private lands, there are many things that we can do to work to adapt to fire, and to make sure that our treatment of the forests is based on protecting those ecosystems and those functions that they provide for us and for the planet as a whole, rather than just seeing that dramatic smoke and the dramatic flames and holding that as, you know, the biggest priority. And that's all I have. Happy to take your questions.
If anybody has a question, feel free to jump in.
What lake is that we see in that video?
This is actually where I live. I live at the northern part of this slide along the banks of the Nooksack River. And that lake is Lake Whatcom, which is the drinking watershed of Bellingham, which is to the left there. So most of the clear cuts you see in this slide are actually state owned. They're DNR, Department of Natural Resource land. Go ahead, Francis.
So I am going to, I've got it copied here, and I'm going to paste it. See if I can paste it. No, I wasn't able to do that, but I just, oh yeah, I was. So can you see what I just pasted in the chat thing? Maybe I need to hit something.
Maybe
like,
send, enter.
I don't see a send or enter. So anyway, it's basically our local Douglas County commissioner sent an email to someone complaining about old growth logging, saying that it's the usual myth, saying that all those old trees, you know, they're going to die and fall down and maybe kill someone when they do, or they're going to burn up. And so you might as well log them and plant them with these nice young tree plantations that are going to suck up carbon. And those old trees can be, the carbon can be stored forever in homes and 2x4s. So this is the myth. I know that this isn't true, but this is the common myth that still is down here in timber industry land, that we have to cut down the old growth to store the carbon in wood products and plant the carbon sucking little baby trees out there. Just, that's what we hear here.
So some things that I like to say in response are like, yes, those trees are going to eventually die and fall down. You know, that's not a myth. That's true. And that's been happening. That's been going on for millions of years. And that's all part of, you know, that's within the planet's carbon balance. That can happen. Trees can fall down and die. Trees can burn. And it'll be okay. What's not okay is to lose the carbon sequestering capacity of forests by logging those trees before they die naturally. And obviously the additional emissions from fossil fuel use. So that's one point. Another point is an old tree, say a 300-year-old tree dies, it's going to probably stay mostly upright for another several hundred years, depending on how big the tree is. And it will decompose so slowly that those emissions, the emissions from that tree would have to be considered to take like 1,000 years total to process from when it began to grow to when it has completely disintegrated. And so this cycle, that's the length of the natural cycle. Whereas logging that tree and putting it in a home, for example, I think in the US we have a 50 to 60 year life of any building before we tear it down and rebuild it. And so on just a straight comparison, sequestering the carbon in a dead log in the forest for a few hundred years is better than sequestering it in your 2x4s in your house for a half a century before you tear it down and build a new building. So maybe try those if you want to send an op-ed back in.
Actually, I really wasn't going to reply to him. I figured it didn't do any good. No matter what science you put to some of these folks, they will never believe us anyway. So, but I hear this all the time, that you just have to, replace those old trees with the young plantations that sequester more carbon. And I know that's not true. So thank you for your response. And if I get a chance, maybe I'll give it a try responding to him. These are our commission.
I think most people could understand that a house may last a century or less before it gets taken down, and that a tree in the forest could last a few centuries as it slowly decomposes. So you don't even have to be super scientific. That's a comparison that I think most people, they just haven't thought about it. So if you could paint that picture, people might go, oh, I just, like, duh. Like, it takes a lot longer for a big tree to decompose than it does for me to rip my house down 40, 50 years later.
And then our county commissioners talk about the milepost 97 fire, which is raging down here in Douglas County, and looking at the smoke and saying, look at all that carbon going up in the air. We could have cut those trees down and sequestered that carbon. Instead, it's all going up into the atmosphere. And so they're so concerned.
Yeah, there's so much stuff in this guide, in this messaging guide, to address all of those things. We try to think of all of the kind of common misconceptions or even intentionally misleading ways that different interests will frame this. I heard someone else trying to ask a question too.
Yeah, before we jump to the other question though, I just want to have everyone on the line. This is the messaging guide that we've produced. It's not a small document. It's meant to be internal. It's meant to be used within the environmental community, people who are communicating to their base about wildfire in the age of climate change. However, we've heard from so many people that they want to educate their elected officials that we are now creating a synthesized version of this guide. And it's not going to be a messaging guide. It'll just be a scientific synthesis. So it will still have the works cited. It will still have the key concepts behind forest carbon and wildfire. And, the whole point that you're bringing up, Francis, will be its own section of this synthesis, because it's a very common narrative amongst local elected officials throughout the Pacific Northwest. So we are developing that now. I expect it to be done in the next 10 days, which really means it will be done in like 20 days. But stay tuned for that. It's coming.
Thank you.
Yes, and with that, we can, whoever was trying to speak up earlier, go ahead and ask your question.
Oh, this is
that was me. That was me. Oh, maybe it wasn't. Maybe it was someone else. Can you hear me?
Yeah, you go ahead. Whoever's speaking, go ahead, and then we'll go to the next person.
All right. Yeah, this is Jason with Sierra Club's Forest and Climate Team, and I was just going to say that we very recently released a report called Forest, Wood, and Climate, where we really tried to get directly to the questions and the comments that were just raised. Pushing back on the narrative that the more wood we cut and use, the better it is in terms of combating climate change. And there's some graphics in there trying to illustrate how forest carbon works and the interrelationship between both forest conservation, but also how different approaches to forest management affect levels of carbon storage. And that's something anyone would be welcome to use those graphics. So I just wanted to say that. But my other comment, it's really not a question, but I was really happy that the last speaker talked about the need to improve industrial forestry, to manage forests on longer rotations and do other things to to increase the carbon storage of working forests. And the reason that I was glad to hear it is that there's a recognition in that, an acknowledgement that logging is going to take place in some places. And I think I've encountered a sort of countervailing view in the conservation community, folks who are active in this movement, that it's essentially anti-logging and takes the stance that really we should eliminate all logging, stop using forest products. At least the audience that I'm working with, which is a lot of folks in the green building movement, that's not a message that's going to resonate. And so I think that it's important, at least for some of us, to talk about what is a scenario under which we will be continuing to log? How do we do it more responsibly? Where are the places where it makes sense to continue logging, in places where it doesn't? It's about the sideboards and what kinds of products should we be producing? And I actually think that long-lived wood products are the best option, you know, and there's this, you know, mantra and this giant move towards mass timber, and a big risk that will increase the extent and the intensity of logging. But if you don't do that, actually mass timber buildings can make a lot of sense, because you can substitute for more carbon intensive materials, and it is a much better use of what comes out of the forest than, say, pellets that you burn for energy, or paper, which rots and releases its carbon in a very short time period. So I think that there's an important role for sort of constructive engagement with the building industry and even the progressive parts of the forest products industry, because we need industry to come along. So that's what I wanted to say.
Thanks, Jason. And if you want to see how we threaded that needle in the messaging guide, it is solution number 5. And we outline what we believe are the principles of climate smart logging. So if you're interested in seeing how we approach that nuanced issue, check out the end of our guide, solution number 5. We have time for one more question before concluding. Who wants to be the last person to ask the question?
Well, I have a comment, but I will defer to someone with a question. I've got to go.
All right, Tim, take it away.
Well, okay, this is addressing that issue. You know, if we don't log these trees, they're going to just burn or rot, and all that carbon will go up in the air. These are natural ecological processes, part of the Earth's, you know, respiration cycles. You know, this is something we're playing with, but making a distinction between the living carbon that is held in, you know, organic beings in the ecosphere, you know, that inhales, exhales, whatever. It's more or less a kind of a closed system, if you will. This is opposed to the dead fossilized carbon that we're exhuming from the lithosphere. And all these grandiose schemes to basically do geoengineering of forests to stop carbon emissions won't mean anything while we are still exhuming dead fossilized carbon and pumping it in the sky. So, you know, I'm willing to talk with them. Yeah, what do you want to do? Landscape scale projects at first, stop the pipelines and, you know, shut off the drilling and the spilling and all the mining and all that stuff. So that's we got to keep rising the prize, gang. They want us to go chasing the red flag of the matador while he skewers us in the knife with you know, fossil fuels. So keep your eyes on the matador. Don't be chasing the red cape of wildfire, all right?
Can I just add, I feel like a lot of this too, like what Tim just said, is common sense. If you go out and look at a forest, like you can see and you can feel a lot of the things that we're talking about in our messaging document. So while this is really, I think while it's obviously extremely important for us to have all of our science in order and be able to combat the misinformation with good science, I think part of like the work that we really need to be doing is bringing people into these burned forests and using this messaging guide and letting people see for themselves, because it's obvious when you go and look that what we're saying is true. And I think that a lot of our community and the people that we're working with and our people, our members are going to understand that.
That's a great point to end on. Thanks, Sam. And thanks to everyone who joined the webinar. This was recorded. I will send around the link as soon as it's uploaded. If you do have any other questions, feel free to reach out to me or any of the panelists, and stay tuned. We'll be developing more materials as the summer goes on. This year it's given us a little bit more time. The smoke hasn't shown up everywhere yet, so this is the time to communicate to folks about wildfire. It's before the impacts really show up for everyone. So stay tuned for more materials, and I'll see y'all on the flip side. Thanks.
Thanks, Alex.